Good morning and most welcome to 1177. We are presently in the lovely Trädgårdsförening, smack in the middle of Gothenburg. An oasis, or a green lung as some people say. It's an excellent area to hold a lecture. It changes the thinking, and this is what this lecture is going to be about. It is where we are and what we do is thinking. Something that modern man do not see. And the lesson is coming from Heidegger. Yes, we are making a leap here, but in Giorgio Buzzacchi we found a segue into the Heideggerian thinking, the Heideggerian ontology. He's pointing to the same things in quite a different language and quite a different thinking. But let me give you an example. Today people think I can be anywhere, I can do whatever, but I can still have the same quality of thinking, intellectualizing, analyzing, clarity. Thinking is wholly independent on where I am or what I do. Both cognitive science and Heidegger has as their foremost spearhead that is not the case. On the contrary, this is what makes up thinking. It is a complementary thing, yes. We Westerners have a great problems how things can be two things at the same time. Either or is our usual span of thinking. Anything more than that seem to be beyond us. For instance, today, in this lovely day, I might think to myself, I'm going to go inside into the warmth under a luminescent light, and there I'm going to sink down, because thinking is just like Descartes, not of this world. That's wrong. And I think this has caused the tremendous inflation, the attenuation of thinking today. It has become more coarse, more dependent on contradictions and truth and falsity than ever before. It's an absolute crudeness. And all that, those values, finesse, dignity, spirituality, that Heidegger valued, are more or less gone today. Even people of the church prefer to sit inside, be slouched in the Platonian Cartesian idea that thinking is of another world. And mind you, it is not a Christian idea that thinking should be elsewhere. It's a Greek idea. And thereby diminishing their power of thinking what they want. Something that can be clearly shown on an fMRI. No doubt it's easy to see who thinks clearly, sharp, complex, and those who don't. And most people today don't. I'm not bragging saying I do it, but it is showing that what Heidegger realized and tried to send to us, reach out to us with, it has become more and more scientifically acclaimed. What I will read today, start reading on, is an uncorrected manuscript of a chapter in Wrathall's book, Heidegger, Coping and Cognitive Science. Wrathall is a master at writing about Heidegger, there's no doubt about that. But I also like his inclination of being very much to the point, not beat around the bush about things. The name of the chapter or the article is called Context and Background, Dreyfus and Cognitive Science. It's written by Adrian Adler. In Hubertus Dreyfus's critique of artificial intelligence, in a footnote, it was in a book in the 70s already, and it caused quite a stir-up. Considerable importance is given to the matter of context, used here as a blanket term covering an immense and possibly heterogeneous phenomenon. Which includes situation, background, circumstances, occasion, and possibly more. Perhaps the best way to point to context is this most general sense is to proceed dialectically and take as a first approximation context to be whatever is revealed as an obstacle. Whenever one attempts to account for mental dynamics on the formal model of combinatorial game over families of interchangeable, fixed, self-standing elements. Dreyfus has argued persuasively that the human mind always operates, if that is the right word, within a setting which permeates whatever it is. It operates on. Dreyfus's thought about these ideas was shaped during the years when artificial intelligence, AI, was at the height of early hopes and initial successes. This was also a period during which what was to become known as cognitive science was little more than a ray of light falling on psychology and linguistics from the rising sun of AI. Neuroscience was scarcely visible. Philosophy of mind, as we know it today, was confined to a small, exclusively philosophical circle, and philosophy of language was only beginning to enter the cognitive term. The whole field has now undergone sweeping reconfiguration as well as an enormous development. On one hand, AI is no longer a central subdiscipline of cognitive science, and it has been thoroughly transformed by the advances of neurocomputing. It is now good old-fashioned artificial intelligence, which has become scarcely visible from the standpoint of mainstream cognitive science. On the other hand, philosophy of mind and philosophy of language have all but fused into one single branch of philosophy, of which a major trend has become a partner in the cognitive enterprise. Despite the changes, Dreyfus's analysis of AI not only continues to be relevant as a critical tool for evaluating the field of AI as it has evolved, as he himself has shown in the third edition in the 72 book. In the book, with his brother Stuart Dreyfus, and in various papers as the present volume proves, but it also raises crucial issues for cognitive science today. However, on the second front, the situation is far less clear, and the present essay aims at showing on a modern scale what sort of clarification is required. The reasons this is not an entirely straightforward matter are twofold. There is, first, the general question of the relation between Dreyfus's work and cognitive science. Less attention than what might have been expected has been paid by either side to the other. This could be the effect of one or two opposite causes. On Dreyfus's part, it could be seen as the consequence of his belief that his main arguments apply mutis mutandis to most of cognitive science, and therefore need not to be spelled out at length, at least not by him. That belief in turn could be supported by either one of two arguments. On the side of the analysis, Dreyfus could claim that his diagnosis of AI is but the outcome of a much more general assessment of the whole Western philosophical tradition, and that cognitive science, for the most part, insofar as it resists straightforward reduction to or absorption by neuroscience, is directly inspired by that tradition, and therefore falls under the same critique. On the one side of the object of the analysis, Dreyfus could be tempted to say that cognitive science is really just AI pursued by more diverse means. It would not even be necessary then to take the long route for the philosophical tradition. Alternatively, Dreyfus could decline the responsibility of assessing cognitive science as a whole and insist on being read as aiming solely at certain paradigm, of which AI is an immediate literal application, and which could, and probably has, informed parts of cognitive science without taking a stand on the extent to which the actual commitments of today's cognitive science relate to that paradigm. Symmetrically, cognitive science may regard the Dreyfusian critique of AI as either too sweeping and thus overshooting the mark, or too restricted to be of concern. If Dreyfus, so might cognitive scientists reason, thinks of his arguments as militating against the very idea of cognitive science, he must be wrong. If on the other hand he takes them to apply only to AI, why should we feel concerned? The second reason why it's no easy matter to assess the mutual relevance of the Dreyfusian analysis of context to cognitive science and vice versa is that there has been a considerable evolution in the way philosophers of language and of mind have been thinking of content and context. In the last 15 years or so, several important research programs have been launched which are all predicted on one or another form of contextualist assumption. The assumption, or perhaps the observation, that context is a crucial and ineliminable aspect of intentionality. These programs have reached a degree of sophistication and depth which make proposal offered in the AR framework look simplistic or obsolete. It would thus be reasonable to expect the contributors to this recent current of thought, on one hand, and Dreyfus and his followers on the other, to acknowledge one another's work. One camp would be praised as pioneers, the other would welcome the fulfillment of its prediction. Why is that? Perhaps there is, appearances notwithstanding, little in common between the two. The issue may be distinct and or the inspirations which guide the analysis orthogonal. Perhaps philosophical styles and traditions makes mutual understanding impossible. However it be, the question deserves to be asked. The paper has two aims. One is simply to lay out in the open what I take to be, in rough outline, on the one hand, Dreyfus's contribution to the general issue of context, and on the other, what the new contextualism is about. Space limitations prevent all historical and textual detail, but enough is provided, I think, to show first that Dreyfus has directly exerted some insufficiently acknowledged influence, but that common sources also have their share in whatever convergence there is. Second, that there is a lot of divergence as well between the two enterprises. The other aim is to sketch some ways of reducing the gap, thus outlining the relevance of Dreyfus's work to some central issues in cognitive science, and conversely, the possibility of bringing recent developments of cognitive science and philosophy of mind to bear on these theses. Let me just get a cup of coffee here. So let's go into the lump of it. 1. Dreyfus's analysis of context, situation, and background. A bird's eye view. At first glance, context, background, situation, circumstances, environment are so closely related and at once so loosely defined that one may wonder whether, appearances notwithstanding, they don't refer to one and the same phenomenon. On the other hand, it would certainly be wrong to defer to common or philosophical usage. On the other hand, it would certainly be wrong to defer to common or philosophical usage, to distribute different contents to these notions as if there were a consensus on how to do it. The fact is that, as far as the terms go, common parlance is hopelessly fickle, while theorists in philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, artificial intelligence, and cognitive science have by no means agreed on a distribution of technical uses. Three basic terms in Dreyfus's vocabulary are context, situation, and background. Dreyfus employs context and situation as nouns standing by themselves, and they are entries, rich ones, in the index of what computers can't do. That is his book from 72. While background does not usually stand alone, being often a constituent of the phrase against the background of, or appearing in expressions such as contextual regularity is the background of problem solving, language use, and other intelligent behavior, and does not appear in the index of the book. Only when discussing many years later Searle's notion of background with a capital B does Dreyfus treat the background as a noun phrase in the subject position and background as some sort of entity. However, the basic idea of background, as it has come to be known following Searle's 83 intentionality, is fully present in Dreyfus's 72 book. And the grammatical difference reflects his well-developed view on the background phenomenon and what distinguishes it from the context and situation phenomena. Context for Dreyfus is at root the setting. To use the vaguest possible word, in which human encounters facts, utterances, problems, etc. The essential feature of context is that it is not definable by rules, nor readily representable in any way. In particular, it does not consist on any given occasion of a finite set of features, let alone pieces of information. The context phenomenon is a basic character of our cognitive or mental lives, which consists in the fact that we are never confronted with any task at all outside the context. There is no such thing as understanding a word, translating a sentence, solving a problem, deciding on the appropriate response to a demand, independently of some context in which the word, sentence, etc. has in fact appeared. For human beings, science demands tasks never show up in isolation. Never, ever. Therefore, whatever fixed meaning, rule, knowledge, representation or information may be thought to be attached to a given sign, demand, task, etc. in the proprietary way, in parentheses here compared, as on the traditional view, the word dog is endowed with a fixed meaning consisting, for example, in a rule for determining the correct application of the word, end of parenthesis, has to be mixed in one way or another with ingredients coming from the context. This view is conceptually compatible with a position which Dreyfus actually rejects. AI of the traditional sort, as well as various schools in semantics and pragmatics, agree that meaningful stimuli or representation seldom come in isolation. The process of understanding or processing such stimuli, they believe, consists in determining the contribution of context, and this processing such stimuli, they believe, consists in determining the contribution of some context, and this they conceive of as discovering a set of relevant aspects of the context, finding the appropriate representation of those aspects, running a kind of inference on the set of premises consisting of the content of information attached to the meaningful stimulus by itself, together with the representations of the relevant features of the context. Everyone agrees that this is a very difficult task. Everyone agrees that this is a very difficult task, but the view is that it is actually performed by the human mind. Therefore, the context problem, which I take to be the scientific problem of describing this process, be it step by step in a restricted family of cases, is a meaningful problem. Let us call this view moderate contextualism. Moderate contextualism stands in contrast with its position, which is even further away from Dreyfus's view, and which may be called context eliminativism. Contextual dependence, according to this other view, is a mere appearance, which a proper reanalysis of the task under consideration will simply eliminate. context-dependent processing or processing of context-dependent items are really nothing but wild varieties of context-free processing of context-free elements. It is all a matter of discovering the right elementary procedures and elements, which is naturally harder than in the case of laboratory-grown varieties, also known as toy problems. As is well known, Dreyfus attacked eliminativism in his 1972 book with such effectiveness when in the mid-80s the connectionist reappeared on the scene with the PDP program. One of the main arguments on the performance end was that connectionists' net were not only context sensitive, but they were naturally so, which meant that they could deal with context without in effect eliminating it. In contrast, said the connectionist, with the old AI program. But the PDP connectionists were in fact moderate contextualists, if not in theory, at least in practice, insofar as the context problem which their models could be conceivably solve was the problem which moderate contextualism construes as the context problem. Because Dreyfus had not considered the possibility of moderate contextualism at first, probably due to the fact that the position he wanted to discredit was AI's eliminativism. He welcomed connectionism as a step in the right direction. However, he had already provided in the 1972 book arguments equally effective against moderate contextualism as against eliminativism. These arguments are those which appeal to the situation and background. Dreyfus doesn't in fact make a clear terminological distinction in the book, and it is only my decision as a commentator to use the label situation for one set of considerations and the label background for another. In Dreyfus's mind, they go hand in hand, and I don't know how helpful he would regard my analytic attempt at peeling them apart. Situation, as I propose to use the term, is based on objective features of the environment. However, as Dreyfus sees it, not only is it not represented, but that it is such that it cannot, in principle, be turned by a cognitive system into a bunch of representations, with the help of which the system then determines the proper course of action. Now, why is such a move impossible? Dreyfus advances two reasons. On the one hand, a situation is holistic. Its brute elements do not exist independently of the context as a whole, or at least they do not carry an intrinsic significance. Only the situation endows them with meaning and relevance. Therefore, it is not open to the system to evaluate the situation on the basis of its elements. On the other hand, the situation already includes the system's expectations and goals. So there isn't even a possibility of first assessing, in whatever way, the holistic contribution of the environment independently of the system state in order to determine the course of action as a function of environmental constraints and internal dispositions. What the environment contributes is, so to speak, laden with the system's views, somewhat in the way in which philosophers of science have come to recognize that observations are theory laden, and even, since Kuhn, that the very meaning of observational terms depends on the theory within which they are developed. The phenomenon of situation per se does not actually spell the inevitable doom of moderate contextualism, although it remains to be shown exactly how situations would be handled in that framework. But context also carries or constitutes a background. And there perhaps lies a reason why context must evade any form of moderate contextualism, however sophisticated. Let's consider again, in as simple a form as possible, the question which is being raised. A human being, or more generally, a cognitive system, is again and again confronted with the problem of what to do next. Although the person or system may not think of its predicament as a problem, let us accept this description and construe it sufficiently broadly as to include, for example, the problem for Mary of how to give meaning here and now to an acoustic stream such as, could you pass the salt? The question being raised again is whether there exists a general method which Mary or any creature or system can apply to the terms of the problem in order to discover its solution. A method which, moreover, could in principle be made fully explicit and be shown to consist of a sequence of simple, unproblematic steps. Such will be the found hope of a sophisticated moderate contextualist. So there are moderate contextualists. According to Dreyfus, that hope is futile because context on a given occasion not only defines a situation but also constitutes a background. The postulated mechanism would in effect treat the occasion as a type, and in order to subsume it under that type, would tear it away from its singular spatio-temporal location. But why should we believe that such an extraction might be possible? This would require an absolute standpoint from which to conduct the operation. In turn, this absolute standpoint could be obtained only by emptying the occasion under consideration of all its features. Indeed, the moderate contextualist's sophisticated strategy consists in distinguishing between the ordinary context, made up of local and localizable features of the occasion, what may be called the proximal context on one hand, and on the other the distal context, which includes all the rest. The immediate objection is that this is more than can fit any manageable notion of context. It is too much to detach. The background which is present on any given concrete occasion is, in his words, something like an ultimate context. The even broader situation, call it human life world. What we have here is something like a logical argument akin to the fact that the collection of all sets is too large to itself be a set. On the reading on the notion, there is nothing such as the background. Rather, the background is the medium, the Husserlian outer horizon, or even perhaps the Jaspersian Umgreifenden. But Dreyfus has a second problem in mind, which he regards as even more serious. For him, background operates as an existential rather than purely logical precondition. In Wittgensteinian language, it is a human form of life, or the human form of life. The human world is pre-structured in terms of human purposes and concerns in such a way that what counts as an object or is significant about an object already is a function of or embodies that concern. A biological counterpart might be von Uexküll's Umwelt, but Dreyfus' major references are Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty. The background in Heideggerian framework is provided by a particular state, mode of being in which an involved human being, not a mere creature, copes with a situation already fully endowed with meaning and bearing with itself, so to speak, the entire equipment necessary for coping. On this reading then, the background is the condition of possibility for there to be anything at all of any significance to a being. A rather different way of construing the background makes it a causal factor in the production of representations. Two options are available here. One is mentalistic and is defended by John Searle in his book Intentionality. Background is a set of non-representational mental capacities that enable all representing to take place. In later works, however, he seems to generalize this notion of the background as witnessed by the following characterization. Intentional phenomena only function within a set of background capacities which are not themselves intentional. Among these capacities are manners of doing, know-how, ways of comporting oneself in the human, in particular, social arena. But background need not be, in Searle's revised picture, mentalistic in a literal sense. When we talk about the background, we are talking about a certain category of neurophysiological causation. The capacities, by which he means abilities, dispositions, tendencies, and causal structures generally involved, need not have an exact description in the vocabulary of psychology. Indeed, one should expect them to usually not have such a description, given that psychology as currently understood is intentionalistic, while background is defined by Searle as composed of non-intentional or pre-intentional capacities. Dreyfus, however, criticizes Searle for falling into the same trap as Husserl. They are both wrong to assume, he writes, that meaning must be brought into a meaningless universe, very good, from outside, as it were, by meaning-giving minds. How great! Yes, yes. He charges both Husserl and Searle to hold on to the notion of something in the head, a noema, or a neurophysiological process, in which the essence of intentionality would lie. End of quote. Seen in this light, background only informs this process, shapes it to give its specific content. Dreyfus rejects this view and wants to steer clear of both a logical and a psychologist construal of the background. For this, he relies in part on Merleau-Ponty's idea of bodily origin of meaning, on the view he defends and which is becoming increasingly popular in cognitive science. Action comes before reflection, and body before mind. Dreyfus. Merleau-Ponty argues that it is the body which confers the meaning, writes Dreyfus. The body is the seat of a learning process, in virtue of which, according to the Dreyfus model, that is him and his brother, the logical world of context-free rules, which in many cases at least guide the beginner, is transformed into a set of generalized bodily habits or skills. This makes the background sound much more concrete and much less transcendental. But Dreyfus emphatically does not want to reduce it to the neuroscientific description of the underpinning of a psychological process. Following Heidegger, Dreyfus denies the possibility of an intention content disconnected from involved coping, at least of primary intentional content. What does exist is derivative intentional content, which is ontologically and presumably ontogenetically, dependent on pre-theoretic understanding, and which would not conceivably arise in the absence of that very special social skill called language. That this would be hard to accept should not surprise us, according to Dreyfus. The whole philosophical tradition has hidden it from our view, producing a transparent account of background is surely beyond the purview of this paper. For our purposes here, it may perhaps suffice to summarize the discussion thus. The background is no thing, not even a set of objective practices, corporal dispositions, acquired skills, or whatever. Rather, it is what practices, corporal dispositions, acquired skills, etc., jointly secrete in historical time, and which makes significance possible. Not logically, not in every possible word, in our human world. Two, the new contextualism. At a distance, it's fairly easy to discern a cluster of ideas, of which, notwithstanding differences in disciplinary origin, motivation, content, fineness of grain, share an interest in contextual phenomena and a conviction that, very roughly, standard formalist approaches are unable to account for them. An additional trait put the pause on. The new contextualism forms a large domain straddling mostly the semantics pragmatics province of linguistics, including computational models, philosophy of language, and increasingly philosophy of mind. Some new contextualists remain formalists, convinced, however, precisely by the unsolvability of the context problem in the classical framework, that new formalisms must be invented, or that formalism itself must undergo reform. At the other extreme, some draw their inspiration from Wittgenstein and have no interest in exploring any kind of formalistic or naturalistic research program. In between are those who are anti-formalists but seek a reformed, non-functionalist naturalism. What keeps the conversation going between them, despite their differences, is a shared Phrygian culture and a common starting point. The matter of meaning, and more specifically the coherence or applicability of the notion of literal meaning. While what gets in the way of a conversation between them and Dreyfus is the latter's starting point, the matter of intelligence, and more specifically the coherence or applicability of the notion of mechanical intelligence. On the cultural side, the existential phenomenology from which he draws his deepest inspiration. The idea that words have a fixed, intrinsic, literal meanings is one of the most entrenched in philosophy, as well as common sense. And it retains its appeal even in the present context-aware atmosphere. One important dimension along which the new contextualist can be ordered is the degree to which they attempt to distance themselves from the thesis that something like literal meaning play a role in the something like literal meaning plays a role in the intentionality of words and of acts of linguistic communication. The leading figure in the moderate camp is David Kaplan. Kaplan's idea is that what is intrinsically attached to a word is not a meaning in one or another traditional construal, intentional or extensional, but rather what he calls character, which is a function from context to contents. In other words, a word standing by itself does not in general directly point to anything at all, and whether material or platonic. Instead, it requires a context of occurrences to do so. Kaplan's goal is to show that the word provides or is constituted by a set of rules which automatically take the occurrent context as input and outputs the content. Some words, according to Kaplan, he calls them pure indexicles, fit this scheme perfectly. There is a rule which, given occurrence of the sentence "I am thirsty," provides the word "I" with its referent versus the speaker in the simple case where the sentence has been uttered. Similar rules work for here, now, today, and so forth. He contrasts these words with what he calls demonstratives, whose content depends on both a static context and on demonstration, a particular event which accompanies the occurrence of the word. Typically, this is accompanied by a pointing event. The bare beginning of a sketch of Kaplan's line of thought will do for present purposes. The following questions can already be intelligibly raised. 1. Does Kaplan's scheme work in the most favorable case, i.e. for pure indexicles? What exactly is a demonstration? 3. Isn't that something to say about what a context is? And isn't it reasonable to ask, in view of Kaplan's goal to provide self-standing semantic rules? 4. Are all contextual effects beyond indexicality and demonstrativity likely to yield to the same sort of treatment? In particular, 5. To what extent is the semantic, properly linguistic level sealed off from the pragmatic, general cognitive level? If the latter somehow leaks into the former, how are we going to protect the objective context from the boundless influence of subjectivity. Or in other words, what is going to protect us from the possibility that any given sentence can get to mean anything at all, according to the participant's states of mind, even when linguistic conventions remain fixed. And thus, finally 6. What if context comes first? In such a way that there can be no context-independent rule attached to words and strings of words, which dictates what parameters need to be assigned values, and what aspects of context are determine these values. The paper's aim is not to provide an encyclopedic, let alone original, answer to these complex, interrelated questions. They motivate an extensive literature to which the reader is referred. Here they can help us set up a few landmarks on the territory. A preliminary observation concerns the relevance of the problems raised by context for linguistic phenomena to the problems concerning cognitive phenomena. In interrogative form, what does Kaplan's line, for example, which is obviously part of the philosophy of language, have to do with the philosophy of mind? Well, the passage from language to thought is provided by the idea that meaning of a declarative sentence is a proposition, and that propositions are the sort of entity which many of our mental states are relations to, attitudes towards. Conversely, it seems natural to individuate many of our mental states by way of specific beliefs. The specification being provided by a declarative sentence. Seen in this light, there is a very close connection between the sentence "it's raining" and the thought or belief that it is raining. This simple transfer principle immediately leads to problems such as the following. There are indexical sentences. Are there correspondingly indexical thoughts? According to the classical Freudian framework, thoughts cannot be indexical. The completion of meaning works at the linguistic level, and the proposition labeled by the sentence is necessary, complete, self-standing. But this is not the case, as John Perry has convincingly shown. There are thoughts or propositions which contain an eliminable indexical element. The transfer principle applied in the reverse direction then raises a question for Kaplan's treatment of pure indexicals in sentences. But Perry's work also raises an interesting point for Dreyfus analysis, as well we briefly indicate in paragraph 3. A related issue is whether all ingredients of a thought are present in the sentence whose meaning it constitutes. Can one think of a thought that involves X without the thought including a thought about X? In the standard framework, the answer is no, but Perry again shows this to be mistaken. Some thoughts at least comprise elements which are not represented, and again this throws a new light on Dreyfus's take on the issue of representation. Perry and his co-author John Barwise are fairly radical. Radicalism may also result from a certain way of examining questions 2 to 6 above. For example, the phrase Jim's book involves a demonstration not only of Jim. The hearer, reader, interpreter of the sentence must know which Jim is being referred to, but also of the relation indicated by the genitive. The classical attitude treats the underdetermination as a form of polysemy, that the interpreter has to choose among the several meanings of the genitive which one applies in the case under consideration. Are we talking about the book Jim owns, or of the book Jim is reading? The trouble is that there simply is no finite list, and actually no list at all, of the relations which Jim may bear to the book. He may be giving it, stealing it, praising it, hating it, printing it, having it wanted to write it for years, using it as a fly swatter, sitting on it to reach his place, thinking about it obsessively, quoting from it, not being able to remember its title, denying it ever existed, and so on ad infinitum. And that is only from the genitive. Hey! Only from the genitive. This is but one case of what is referred to since Friedrich Waismann as the open texture of natural language, and examples such as this are so familiar among the new contextualists that one sometimes marvels at how much delight seems to go into making up ever better and wilder variations in order to illustrate very similar points. Of course, the inspiration here is Wittgenstein, and the best representative of unabashed radicalism as far as linguistic contextualism goes is Charles Travis, the author of a book subtitled Wittgenstein's Philosophy of Language. Travis's thesis is that the truth condition of a sentence are occasion dependent. Whether it is the case or not that there is water in the refrigerator depends on the occasion in which the sentence is considered or uttered. Is the topic drinkable water in an accessible container? an incisable quantity, or is it humidity rendering the refrigerator electrically permeable, or is it frost on the coils, or is it H2O molecules in the cottage cheese, etc.? Contrary to pure indexicals, polysemous words, lexicalized metaphors, anaphoras, and the like, sentences such as "there is water in the refrigerator," or "York lies 25 miles northwest of Leeds," or "the table is covered with breadcrumbs," don't bear their incompleteness on their sleeves. They contain no pointer to some element whose interpretation is both needed for an understanding of the sentence and requires searching the context, the circumstances of the occasion. It is the context which tells the interpreter which features of the sentence need contextual determination. Words on that view lose their leading role, which is theirs in the traditional picture, and remains theirs in moderate form of contextualism. Yet, another important feature of examples of this sort is that they can undergo an indefinite number of additions, such that the truth conditions of the sentence or the applicability of the predicate under consideration undergo a brutal change at every addition. This shows that there is no locality principle in virtue of which, given a sentence, there is a pre-specified list of aspects of the context which is sufficient to consult in order to fix its truth condition. This is a form of holism which does not appeal to notions such as the sense of the situation, the practices of the community, the involvement in a form of life, in short, the background in one or another form, but is every bit as threatening to the formalist view. Reference to Wittgenstein, as well as the general flavor of examples in this literature, and also the passion for collecting these examples. These signs all point to two authors well known to the reader. One is Dreyfus, of course. The other is John Searle, who deserves a special mention here for his theoretical contribution, of course, but also because of the likeness of some of his views to Dreyfus's. Very roughly, Searle uses context in the straightforward sense. At first as an argument against the cognitivist view of the mental, he then generalizes his notion of context to background and uses background as an argument against the intellectualist component of cognitivism. Third, though not last chronologically, he argues against the informational functionalist component of cognitivism. All of this is very forcefully written up in books and papers which appeared from the late 70s to the mid-90s. But all this is present. Coached in different language and framed in a different setting in Dreyfus's 1972 book. The paradox is that Dreyfus quotes Searle, in his later writings, while Searle hardly ever quotes Dreyfus. Indeed, it sometimes seems as though Searle enacts his own Chinese room thought experiment with what computers can't do. Instead of the Chinese phrasebook, it may well be that although the book does not figure in the bibliography of the rediscovery of the mind, Searle has not read it, but he certainly has absorbed it through osmosis, which is as less of a miracle than might appear to one who is not familiar with the lively exchanges on the topic of AI prompted by Dreyfus's arrival in Berkeley in 1969. During the 20-odd years when Searle's philosophy of mind developed, a constant flux of students, teaching assistants, postdocs, fellows of the richly endowed Institute of Cognitive Science gathered intellectual pollen from various teachers and disperse it to everyone's benefit. The critique of artificial reason, which made Dreyfus famous in some circles and gives the book its subtitle, appeared in 1972, but was in the stage of intensive preparation in the years immediately preceding, and in particular was at a 2-year seminar which many people attended, and where well-known philosophers such as Charles Taylor gave talks. Chapter 9 of Searle's Rediscovery, published in 1992, is entitled The Critique of Cognitive Reason, without a reference to Dreyfus's 1972 book. Similarly, Searle says at the beginning of Chapter 8 that in the early 1970s he began investigating the phenomena that he later came to call the background, and somewhere he writes that his theory is akin to no one else's except perhaps Bourdieu, but that the investigation actually started in the mid-1960s by Dreyfus and essentially concluded by the early 1970s. The basic arguments, the basic features of background, the kinds of examples, all this was laid in open in Dreyfus's 1972 book. There is a lesson in this which has something to do with the context. In fact, what must have happened is that Searle was so caught up in his initial problem, which was to make of Wittgenstein's attack on Fregean ideas about meaning, that he did not realize he was picking up ideas which Dreyfus was developing across the hall while thinking about the mind. As he admits, the thesis that only against background are conditions of satisfaction defined was originally a claim about literal meaning. But how he now believes what applies to literal meaning applies also to the speaker's intended meaning, and indeed to all forms of intentionality, whether linguistic or non-linguistic. But this is a rediscovery of the mind as Dreyfus pictured it in print 20 years earlier. Before leaving the new contextualism, a word should be said about the extreme form of radicalism, within the current of thought. For thinkers such as Lawrence Barsalou, Douglas Hintzman, or Roland Langacker, meanings vanish entirely from the theoretical horizon. They are replaced essentially by repertoires of cases. In other words, by encyclopedic information acquired through exposure. This is quite close to Dreyfus's idea that an intelligent mind proceeds not by applying roots, but calling forth from experience a collection of examples, applying an intuitive similarity metric, and finally dealing with the problem at hand in roughly the same way as with the experience closest to it. One final remark may help in making out the level at which Dreyfus and the contextualists are converging. If they are right, a consequence of either view is that pure reflection plays a lesser role in mental life, in intelligent behavior, than the first cognitivist thought, and that what is no longer attributable to reflection must be borne either by the environment or by the mind itself, but then not in the form of representations. There may well be representations. Some contextualists such as Searle tend to believe it. Dreyfus, or at least some of his radical followers, tend to doubt it. But at any rate, they all argue in favor of a non-representational ground on which mental life rests, either somehow directly or via representational process. Narrowing the gap. Despite their overlap and similarities, Dreyfus and the new contextualists are equally clearly not saying all of the same things. Not only do they have different theoretical goals and thus focus on different aspects of the phenomenon, but they also differ in the way they cut things up. And quite likely they actually disagree on important points. To narrow the gap does not mean to make the positions appear to be close, but to lower their degree of incommensurability. At this final section, I will attempt to bring out features of the respective frameworks with the hope of offering a clearer picture of the problem situation. Besides, the issues raised are of interest in their very own right. It is a striking fact that mind and intelligence have very complex and very different grammars. It is tempting for an outsider to think that Dreyfus and a typical contextualist such as Searle or Perry are simply not onto the same topic, one being concerned with intelligence, the other with mind. Insiders know better. Grammar is misleading, they believe, and everyone is in fact after the same thing. The truth, I suggest, lies somewhere in between. There are at least two reasons for the grammatical complexities. The first is that intelligence is polysemous, even within the present context. In one usage, it is nearly synonymous with mind, as in newborns or dogs are intelligent. In another, it's a graded property of something: mind, behavior, person, and even though perhaps metaphorically, system, institution, machine. The second source of complexity lies in the ontology. Mind is either regarded as a thing or as a function. On the reified Cartesian view, intelligence is an accident of the essence mind. It can still be either roughly coextensial with mind, the non-graded sense, or belong to mind a lesser or greater degree. On the functional view, intelligence is either strictly synonymous with mind or denotes its graded quality. The whole idea of Turing in his famous paper In Mind is to get rid of these perplexities by adopting a stance which one could call grammatical behaviorism, and which may or may not, depending on further theoretical options, result from plain scientific behaviorism. Intelligent behavior in this view becomes the sole primitive notion, and mind and intelligence remain only as derivative notions, one with a built-in threshold and one without. AI, which is Dreyfus's topic, is a form of behaviorism, directly bequeathed by Turing, but it brings in mind through the back door. It postulates representations. Whether or not this is an inevitable consequence of the Turingian option is a difficult question, which must be left for another occasion. The crucial point of our purpose is that Dreyfus's main target is precisely that move. AI's original sin for him is not its behaviorism. It is its representationalism, its intellectualism. Dreyfus doesn't fault AI for being too behavioristic, but for being inconsistent in its behaviorism. It isn't behavioristic at all the way, and in the right way. That is, in the way sketched by Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty. This is the deep reason why the problem of AI is the right problem for Dreyfus to tackle, or rather, why is it for him the right entry into the problem of mind. Although his ontology of mind remains mostly implicit, he is a radical anti-Cartesian and eliminativist about the mind. The new contextualists, on the other hand, have as their starting point not behavior, but language. They are after linguistic understanding. Everybody knows since Chomsky's famous review of Skinner's book that language is the Achilles heel of psychological behaviorism. But Frege already had a Cartesian view on mind, and so did Brentano. Frege provides the framework for a mainstream philosophy of language, and Brentano provides mainstream philosophy of mind, with a definition of mind as bearer of representations. The new contextualists, by and large, belong squarely into that tradition. Thus, it is now plain that Dreyfus and the new contextualists, with different points of departure, meet the topic of mind. It is equally plain that they deeply disagree. Dreyfus defends a sophisticated behaviorism. The new contextualists defend a sophisticated Cartesianism, or too sophisticated, or to accommodate Searle's position, a sophisticated representationalism. The irony is that both camps use arguments from the phenomenology of context to show the inadequacy of the crude versions of their respective options. Contextualists disprove simple-minded cognitivism, and Dreyfus disapproves simple-minded behaviorism indirectly, by showing that cognitivism in any form is false for reasons which apply equally to behaviorism in the classical construals. Cognitism is indeed, seen from the right perspective, behaviorism pursued by novel means. The way of putting the matter is an oversimplification, however. As we have seen, among the new contextualists, while a majority lean toward naturalism, a minority tend to oppose it. This is where radicalism matters. Very radical contextualists side with Dreyfus against all of their less than fully radical colleagues. Or rather, they would side with him, presumably if they cared, as he does, to disapprove the possibility of cognitivist enterprise. Moderate contextualists, however sophisticated, hold on to the hope of discovering a calculus of thought which would faithfully model contextual effects while lending itself to mechanization by virtue of being a calculus in at least roughly the sense imagined by AI. This stance is exemplified in a particularly clear and coherent way by Sperber and Wilson's relevance theory. While recognizing and indeed illustrating by entertaining and convincing examples the open texture of communication, they defend a mechanistic account of interpretation. According to them, a hearer retrieves from among the indefinitely many possible interpretations of a speaker's utterance the correct one, by non-consciously observing a double maximization principles. She goes for the most relevant at the cost of the less processing effort, and this works because the speaker is non-consciously counting on her to follow this strategy. Well, the voice of the friend, I would say here. Clearly, the hearer's task is a very particular one as far as cognitive task goes. Retrieving a speaker's communicative intention, as I have argued elsewhere, has a number of features which make it comparatively simple from the theoretical standpoint. But this is not a critical issue from a Dreyfusian perspective. What Dreyfus wants to know is whether anyone claims to have a theory of relevance. But Sperber and Wilson are quite clear about the scope of their theory. That principle of relevance does not define, quantify, or characterize in any way the relevance for the hearer of information she can potentially extract from an utterance by exploiting contextual clues. Such a task would be, they believe, hopelessly unconstrained. Their goal is to show how communication proceeds in a given landscape of potential relevance. Relevance theory is not a theory of relevance, but a theory of communication based on the idea that interpretation is inferential, that inference is permissive and therefore requires control, and that maximization of relevance, subject to minimization of effort, provides the necessary control principle. Well then, it seems legitimate to ask whether the theory, beyond its obvious contribution to pragmatics, has a role to play in the overarching enterprise of naturalization of the mental. It is clearly meant to be. One should therefore expect the authors to hope that their theory would, in the fullness of time, hook on to a naturalistic account of relevance. Now sophisticated cognitive scientists don't take the failure of old AI's attempts at providing such an account as negative evidence against its possibility. But they are bound to pay attention to Fodor's arguments in part 4 of Modularity of Mind against the possibility of a science of central processing, in other words, a science of thought. Fodor bases his attack on, roughly, the consideration of context and explicitly refers to Dreyfus in the penultimate paragraph of his book. Fodor's general line can be characterized as an argument against the possibility of a theory of relevance. So that while leaving untouched relevance theory, Fodor points to severe potential limitation of its importance for cognitive science. One should therefore expect the authors of relevance theory to try and undermine Fodor's line. Indeed, Sperber mounts an attack against Fodor's impossibility theorem for cognitive science, by questioning the irreducibly non-modular character of central processes. Although he does not claim to hold a solution to the problem of relevance, he argues that central processes are modular to a certain or perhaps large extent. In a certain way, Dreyfus could partly agree with Sperber's line. After all, as we have seen, he agrees that there is a non-representational dimension of mind. But of course, he joins with the central processes are of vastly different nature than Dreyfus's embodied skills and concern coping. And Fyodor's intuitions on the matter, which for once echo Dreyfus's, retain most of the appeal despite Sperber's plea for domain specificity. The reader, or your listener, may feel at this point that the story is told. Let me take the pause there. The reader may feel at this point that the story is told. Dreyfus believes that intelligence can't be mechanized or naturalized for that matter, while the new contextualists believe that literal meaning is not the centerpiece of linguistic theorizing. These concerns only partially overlap. That they do overlap is what I've been at pains to show, so that some agreement is possible and actual to a small extent, and disagreement is possible and actual to a large extent. But the opposition is too oblique to be resolved. Yet, this is perhaps not the end of the story. Each camp has its blind spot, and each has ideas which the other could profit from. There are several issues that are worth exploring. One is the self. Perry has shown that egocentric thoughts must have a very particular, quite unphrygian structure if they must enter into an adequate account of action. This connects on one hand with the ontology of mind, and on the other with Dreyfus's account of the Merleau-Pontinian conception of the centrality of the body in behavior. It is quite striking that traces of the primacy of the concrete bodily ego should be found in the very structure of the simplest, ontogenetically earliest thoughts. Another issue is Dreyfus's basic taxonomy of states of mind, inspired by his reading of Heidegger's Being and Time, Division 1. Thoughts about hammers, for example, come in two varieties according to the mode of state of mind of which they are part. In the involved mode, there is no concept of or representation of the hammer as a separate object in objective space-time. With objective intrinsic properties, although there is a competent coping with a hammer, and also, as Dreyfus came to see, a form of awareness of the hammer. In detached mode, the hammer thought looks like a traditional representation, but it results from a rational reconstruction. It is not primitive or basic. The passage from one to the other mode occurs on the occasion of a breakdown. That is, the hammer not fitting in the fluid, competent coping in which the subject is engaged. The question, which can be raised from the standpoint of neurophysiology and neuropsychology of motor action, but also perhaps by re-examining its phenomenology, is whether every state does not include both a deliberative, detached component and an involved automatic component. This would not sit well with the thesis of the primacy of the involved mode of thinking. One place to look further inspiration on this issue is to developmental psychology. Babies are not prone to deliberation in the standard sense, yet they seem to display a highly differentiated and systematically evolving pattern of conceptual competence. This is not the time to pursue either of these issues, but enough has been said, I hope, to show that Dreyfus's critique of artificial intelligence, far from setting him apart from contemporary cognitive science, puts him and his followers in direct contact with it. As always, contact means risk for both sides, as well as potential for enrichment. Of course, the last two things I mentioned here, involvement and not so involved, are the words from Heidegger. Zuhanden, involvement, and Vorhanden. And they could be complementary and go into each other. Heidegger is pointing to the extremes of both modes. We can have a conception of the hammer we're working with, but I would also say that working with the hammer is a priori of understanding the hammer in a forehand way. There can be no understanding whatsoever starting with a detached mode, none. And this is what John Searle is trying to do, and of course this is the earlier artificial intelligence movement's mood or goal, you could say. That is to detach humankind from reality, set up a set of so-called rules, whatever they mean by these rules. I don't think they are proper rules, but they use the word rules. And thereby eliminating some factors of reality, taking those things away, and somehow thinking now meaning is becoming stronger. We detach things, we cut them off, we separate them, and thereby we have a possibility of reaching into meaning. And this closed meaning, this limited meaning, is of course also something that Derrida pointed out in Limited Incorporated, his opening up of John Searle. and his intentionality. Intentionality inside the mind. Is it truly in the mind? So what Dreyfus and of course Mark Wrathall with this article is doing is showing it is not absolutely clear what the AI people are doing. They need to investigate into how they use these words. And I think rule is a tricky one. Are those things rules in a way that governs behavior or something that we can sort of submit to or do and can help us, rules that inform our actions, rules like two-handed rules, or are they a priori four-handed rules that are so to speak uncreated, not real, not of substance? That's tricky. Don't fall into the trap and say, I don't like rules in language. That's trap. Is the trap that Langecker fell into, I would say. And it's a dangerous trap. It limits the scope. It doesn't go into the depth of the matter. It then becomes much more superficial, not as clear, not as decisive. Because if you take the whole thing in, then you get a finger line, you get a directionality, you get a true meaning. This is what Wrathall is saying, this is what Dreyfus is pointing to, this is what Heidegger means. It's not taking away our one directionality, it's showing it, and showing that meaning also comes from the world. And I would say there is an indirect criticism of the blank slate here. By saying that the world could be subsumed under this almost ridiculously superficial idea of how they use the word rules. They turn the world into a blank slate. Yes, with objects, but without meanings. And the only thing that can give meaning to the world is the ego. It's the same thing. Ego as meaning giver, world as meaningless, or lacking meaning. That's a more proper word, not meaningless, sorry. Lack of meaning, not having the inherent factor of meaning, or putting down as a postulate that the world doesn't have a meaning, or assuming it rather, non-verbally assuming that the world doesn't have meaning, which is exactly what James Locke did and Kant did, and also David Hume. Meaning only comes from the subject. There is no meaning inherently in the world. This cannot add to meaning, can make anything clear. I don't have to be in this situation. Situation is probably some sort of decoration, unnecessary. One way of thinking of this video could be that I only choose this environment to make it more decorative. It's not an essential part of the lecture. They are a decorum. They can be extracted, and the true meaning of what I say, or what Wrathall said, is here inside the video somewhere, and this is extra. And Dreyfus is saying, by thinking in that manner, meaning will be obliterated. Directionality will not be. This is very, very important to understand. And I would say, from my own perspective, it would be very odd that a true direction and a true meaning, a decisiveness, a clearness and direction somehow could be made by taking things away from the world, assuming this to be that this could be Mars or Alpha Centauri, or this could be a projection coming from an artificial intelligence machine, or that this could be the Matrix. All those Searlean mistakes are also coming from his own embodiment. It should be remembered without Searle being himself in some manner being disembodied, he could not come to the conclusions he has come to. He must himself be the disembodied Searle. And this could be made in Disney World or Pixar or somewhere else. These are just bits. What Heidegger is pointing to, the whole idea of an inside, is in itself not a fault, not an error, not something bad. It needs to be widened and seen as a narrowing somehow, and that narrowing is in mind. It's not allowing or not being able to process parallel things, inside and outside at the same time, and thereby not understanding inside and outside are absolute predisposition. The before of inside and outside are the predisposition for an inside and outside to exist, not the other way around. Yes, of course, this is beautiful, but it's not inessential. It is not. The beauty doesn't take away the possibility for it to have meaning. I don't give meaning to these things only. It has meaning by itself. Could you see? You can transfer the idea of mind being a blank slate to the idea that the world is a blank slate. Imagine taking all this away, everything is just pure whiteness, and then comes somebody from Walt Disney or Pixar putting in dots here, there, creating this environment. There are such ideas now that it could be an artificial intelligence, all of it. This is exactly what Dreyfus says is a mistaken thinking. It is not wrong, it is a mistaken thinking. This is not a previous blank slate. It has always been there. I have always been here. And the whole idea that we are a blank slate from the beginning, and that is a possibility for understanding the world, is nonsensical. It is not wrong in any way, it's just nonsensical, which is quite a different thing. I think as long as you think it's wrong, you're a bit missing the point. It is more complex than that. And it needs to be understood. It's not enough to agree in this case. Heidegger doesn't want you to agree with him. He wants you to, if possible, to understand him. That's the way to go about things. And it helps to encounter Mark Wrathall, Dreyfus, and Capobianco. But of course, there is a hidden treasure in Sein und Zeit. And time is of the essence, and time down to the very essence where you start. Kaplan seemed to be starting off on the wrong foot. And once you start on the wrong foot, there is, the further you go, the wronger you get. That is also part of it. It's no chance by following the same route you're all of a sudden going to go into the right path. No, not in this case. That would not work. Okay, I think it's enough of a summary here. I'll say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon.